In this video, we explain how to do the tic-tac-toe exercise in Khan. Khan provides you a start with a description of how the game is played and most of the code you need to play it. In 3 steps in this exercise, you get to have a functioning tic-tac-toe game. It says here that you have to set player turn, number of columns, and number of rows, and symbols. I'm going to set these, and then we're going to go through the code, and I'm going to explain exactly how this code works. After I've explained it, then we'll go on and do steps 2 and steps 3. So to understand how to set these variables that it's asking you to set, let's look at the code. Player turn is going to be either 0 or 1, and we'll see why in a minute as we go down here and look at what symbols is. So in fact, let's start with symbols. The hint says that symbols has an open square bracket and then something, a comma, and something in a closed square bracket. This means that symbols is an array. That's what the square brackets mean. And there are 2 things in the array. So what the symbols are going to be, it's going to be an array with the 2 symbols for tic-tac-toe, X and O. And notice I put them in the single quotes because they're characters. So now I've finished symbols. It's got X and O as its 2 symbols. And those are going to be the symbols that go in the squares once we have the code drawing the squares. So what player turn is, it is going to be a global variable that keeps track whether it's X's turn to go or O's turn to go. So player turn is going to be an integer. It's going to be either 0 or 1. Why 0 or 1? Because it's going to be used to index this symbols array. If it's 0, then X will be going on the screen, and if it's 1, then the O will be going on the screen. So I'm going to set player turn initially to be 0, and make myself a little comment here that says that player turn indexes the symbols array to put X or O on the screen. Player turn should only have the values 0 or 1. Alright, so that's just a little comment to remind myself what player turn is. Now to finish this, num columns is the number of columns in a tic-tac-toe board. In a typical tic-tac-toe board, there are 3 columns and 3 rows to get the 9 squares of tic-tac-toe. So I'm going to put in the number of columns equals 3 and the number of rows equals 3. And here the tic-tac-toe board is drawn by the code, and you can see that if I minimize this down, here are the 9 squares of tic-tac-toe. And it's telling me that I finished my step, so I'm able to go on to the next step. So in this first step, we finished player turn, number of columns, number of rows, and the symbols array. And we started to understand what was going on with the code. We're now going to go through the code and explain how it works. The first thing we see here is var tiles equals an open close. What this is, it's an empty array. Open and close square brackets means it's an array with nothing in it. It's an empty array. When we're done, we're going to be putting into that all of the tiles, the 9 tiles that make up the tic-tac-toe game. You did something similar to this if you did the Make It Rain Khan exercise, and for some of you an assignment, where the raindrops started off with empty arrays, and you filled them with for loops to put in 100 X positions, 100 Y positions, and 100 colors. So the idea of starting with an empty array and then using a for loop to fill it up is something we've seen before, and we're going to do that here. So this is just the array that's going to hold the 9 tiles in the tic-tac-toe game. The next chunk of code, from here, var tile, through this code, through here, this is declaring a class called tile, which will be each of the 9 tiles that make up the tic-tac-toe board. Let's look at the code for this class. So scrolling back up, the first thing we see here is the constructor function. Remember how constructor functions work. Var tile equals a function. It'll be called by the new call and passed an X and a Y, and this will make a new tile. Later on in the code, we'll see that this gets called 9 times to make 9 of these tiles. We'll pass in the x and y position of the tile, and the constructor will store it as this.x and this.y. It'll also figure out the size. The size is the width of the screen divided by the number of columns. That's the size of each tile, so it fills it up. We'll also set the initial label for the tile to be the empty string. That's an open double quote followed by a closed double quote. That's the empty string, meaning nothing is on the screen. Eventually, labels will take on x and y as we start to play the game. So this is the constructor function for making tile objects. And it will be called 9 times to make the 9 tiles. The next chunk of code here is a method. You can see it here by the name of the class, tile.prototype, and the method's name is draw. So it's a function, and it draws the tile. It sets the fill and the stroke weight, draws the rectangle for it, makes a big text size, sets a fill, and then texts out to the screen this.label. And this.label is empty. Initially it's empty. Let me make a comment here that this is either going to be empty, or it can be x, or it can be O. Initially it's empty, but as we play the game, the tiles labels will take on X and O. And whatever it is, at the time that this draw function is called, this text will draw the label out. So it'll draw it out empty at first, but as we put X's and Y's in, this dot label will be an X, or no, sorry, not X's and Y's, X's or O's. The next piece of code we see is a method called empty. And all it does is it checks to see if the label equals, the 3 equal signs is a test for equality, to see if the label of the tile equals empty. If it does, this function returns true, otherwise it returns false. So this is a Boolean function that returns true or false based on whether this label up here is the empty string or not. The next chunk of code we see is a method of the class tile called onClick. And this method will be called whenever this tile is clicked. And it's actually going to do the work. You can see in the comments that Khan provided what the work is. If the tile that was clicked on is not empty, meaning there's an X or a Y already there, then exit the function. We're done. There's already something there. The user clicked on it by mistake, because they can only really fill in empty. So if there's already something there, exit the function. Otherwise, put in the tile the player's symbol by whoever the current player is, and then change the turn of to the next player. That's the algorithm for what happens when a tile is clicked on. And this code isn't done yet. So this is part of the exercise, is to fill this code in. So we'll come back and do that. First we're going through to understand the code. But we will be putting code in where these comments are. The next piece of code is again a method of tile. So it's tiles, and then we call this method handle mouse click. And we're also going to be writing this as part of the exercise. But basically we're going to see all it does is to see if the current tile that we're thinking about with if this tile was the one clicked on. And all it's going to do is check to see if the X and Y where the mouse was clicked is in the X and Y of a tile, and we'll do that for each tile. You did this kind of similar if you did the quiz assignment that we gave you, where it was a multiple choice quiz and you had to see which answer was clicked on by checking where the X and Y of the click was. Do a similar thing here to see which tile was clicked on, to see if we have to put an X or an O in the tile. And that will be done later as well. Moving down, the next piece of code we look at is this for loop. So we're now done with the tile class. We're outside of the tile class now. The tile class had the methods handle mouse click, on click, empty, had its draw function, its constructor function. So now I'm outside, and what this for loop does, it's a for loop for I equals 0 to less than number of columns, plus plus I. It has a nested for loop inside for j equals 0 to number of rows, and it pushes a new tile at x position, this math here, and y position, this math here. This is putting the 9 tiles, because there are 3 rows and 3 columns, so 3 times 3 is 9. It's pushing 9 tiles into the array. Again, this is similar to how in the raindrops assignment we had an empty array and we pushed in however many raindrops you said, 100 or whatever number of raindrops you had. But here we're pushing in 9 tiles using a for loop running 3 times and a nested for loop inside of it that'll run 3 times. So this call to push gets called 9 times total. Moving down, this code is a function called draw tiles. It's a function definition. It hasn't been called yet, so it's not doing anything until we call it. In fact, we'll call it down at the bottom in the main draw loop. But this draws the tiles. It's got a for loop, and its for loop is a little different than what we've probably have seen before. It uses the in word. I'm not sure that Khan has actually introduced this in what you may have seen at this point. But basically what this is, for var I in tiles, it's equivalent to have written this. For var I equals 0, I less than the tiles array dot length plus plus I. So we could have written that, but what they wrote here in Khan was for var I in tiles, which is really just shorthand for what I have here in the comment. Okay, this is a comment, so it won't run. It's just a comment showing what this in that you may not have seen before means. So anyway, the for loop will run. In this case, it'll run 9 times, and it's going to call tiles indexed by I.draw. It'll call the draw method on each tile. And remember, our draw method for a tile is up here, so it'll call this 9 times, which will draw all 9 tiles on the screen. So this little function, draw tiles, is drawing the 9 tiles on the screen. Moving down, the mouse released function is one of those built-in functions in the Khan environment where it gets called anytime the mouse is clicked and then released. So this will be an event that gets called every time the user clicks the mouse, basically at the end of the click when they release. What it does, it's another one of those for loops with an I in it, so it's going to do all the tiles, and it's going to go tiles indexed by I, and it's going to call the handle mouse click method with the current mouse X and mouse Y. What this does is it goes through all tiles to see which one was clicked. And that's so it's calling handle mouse click, and as we said before up here, the handle mouse clicks check to see if that was the one that was clicked on by seeing if it's in the tile. And we'll see again how this all this works when we go back to the exercise. Right now we're trying to understand the code that Khan gave us. We're almost done. The last piece of code here is the draw loop. And you've seen this before in all the animations you've done. When you have something called draw, it gets called over and over and over again, basically forever as long as the program's running. So what's being done over and over and over again? The background's being drawn, and then we call draw tiles, which is this function up here, which draws all 9 tiles. So basically the draw loop is going over and over and over again, constantly redrawing the tiles. But if the mouse gets clicked on by the user, there might be an X or Y or X or 0 put into the tiles, and then when it's drawn over and over again, the X or the O will show up. And that's how this code works. So now that I've explained all the code, let's go on to the next step in the Khan exercise. So I completed the first step by putting these values in for the variables. The next step is going to have me write a function. So let me go on to the next step. And the next step says detect mouse clicks. And it's going to have you write the handle mouse click method that I showed you earlier. It explains a little bit about how it works by accepting the X and Y and determining if it's in the square. Now sometimes on these Khan exercises, if they give you a code outline like this, it's actually a good idea to copy the code outline, and you can paste it in and then fill in the things that they need. So I've copied this code, and I'm going to go down to my exercise. Remember that I'm writing the handle mouse click function. So I'll go down here to where the handle mouse click function is, right here, and I'll replace this code by pasting in the outline code. And the outline code shows you how this method works now. So here's the tile, prototype, handle mouse click equals a function that takes x and y as its parameters and does a check to see if x, so if we're looking to see if this is the tile, we want to see if the x they clicked on is greater than this x but less than this x, and that the y that they clicked on is greater than this y but less than this y. And again, you did something similar if you did the quiz app with multiple choice, where you're trying to see where the click was and if it was on the right answer. So they give you an outline here, and they say basically there's 4 things you have to check. If the x that was clicked on is greater than something and it's less than something else, and the y was greater than something and the y was less than something else. So it lays it out for you. Well, this corner up here in a general tile is going up here. Here's the general tile. It's this dot x. That's the general tile x position. So I'll put in this dot x. And that's checking to see if the click is over here greater than this corner. And is x less than this corner? This corner is, going back and looking at my tile, it's this dot x plus this dot size, because size is the size of the tile. So I can go and check if the clicked on x is greater than this dot x plus this dot size. I'm going to let you go do it yourself for y, but it's very similar to what you did for x up here. After you finish this big long if statement, take a look at the body of the if statement. If this if statement's true, which basically means they clicked in a certain tile, then call the onClick function for that tile. And the onClick function, or method, the onClick method, sorry, for that tile is up here. And that's actually going to do the work of putting the x or the o in. This one that we're writing now in step 2 of the con exercise is just detecting if you clicked in a particular tile, and then it'll call the this.onClick to do the work. So I'll let you go ahead and finish this by putting the right things in for y, and then we'll come back and do the next step. After you finish that function by filling in the y, you'll be allowed to go to the 3rd step, and I'm here on the 3rd step. The 3rd step says that we have to finish the onClick method. And once we do, we can actually start playing the game. So again, what they've done is they've given you an outline for the onClick code. So I'm going to copy that. And I'm going to go into their code and replace their code with code I just copied by pasting it in, and now I have to fill it in. So let's look what I'm filling in. Here's the onClick function, or method, onClick method. Prototype onClick equals a function if not this empty, which basically means this empty is checking to see if it's an empty, but if then the exclamation point means not. So if this dot empty is not empty, basically if this is not empty, what do we want to do? Well, the specification said if they've clicked on it and it's not empty, what it means by not empty, it means there's an X or an O there. If the user clicks on a place that there's already an X and O, don't do anything. So what we're simply going to do is return. Okay, that means the method is returned and nothing else will get done. So if we're going on, then we didn't return, which means that it was empty, and we want to put an X or an O in there. So we're going to set this dot label. And remember that this is referring to the clicked on tile. We only got to this onClick by figuring out which tile was clicked on, and we called the onClick method for that tile. So we want to set the label of the tile that was clicked on to symbols. Now remember, symbols is an array with 2 elements, X or O. So since it's an array, we have to index it with either 0 or 1 to either put an X or an O in as the symbol. So we put in here This dot label equals symbols. We have to index it with either a 0 or a 1. But we're not going to use 0 or 1. We're going to use this thing called player turn, which I said will either be 0 or 1. Initially it's 0 because it's X's turn. But we're going to change player turn to 1, and then back to 0, then back to 1 as the players take turns. So player turn will either be 0 or 1, and we'll use that to index the symbols array to pull out either the X or the O. And we'll do that here. So simply index it by player turn. Now, the next thing we have to do here, see this plus plus? Something has to get incremented after we've done this. So we want player turn to be incremented, go from 0 to 1, because it's the next player's turn. So player turn plus plus moves it from 0 to 1. Now we say if player turn is greater than symbol's length, which is 2, then set player turn back to 0. And this is how we alternate by adding 1 to the player, and if it gets greater than 2, putting it back to 0, or greater than 1, putting it back to 0. That's how we're going to go from 0 to 1 in the player turns. And whoever's player turn it is, that number will index the symbols array to get the X or the O. We'll set the label, and that's how we finish the con exercise. And once you finish the con exercise, which they're saying I did, this now works. You can click on it and get an X, click and get an O, click and get an X, O. What it isn't doing right now, it's not checking to see if a player has won. That is done in a function that we haven't written yet called checkWin. And we're not going to do that in this video. We're going to leave this up to you to check to see if you can write the code to figure out how a player won. But before you get to this, see if you can get the exercise to work so you have a functioning game.